Hey everyone, welcome back to Shop Life. In this video we are going to be talking about the most common issues related to the E46 M3. So I already have a video similar to this that covers most of all of the E46 chassis in general, so mostly the non-Ms, but this video is just going to be specifically issues that are present on the M3s. So if you guys have an E46 or are looking into an E46, make sure you go watch the other video first, and then if you are trying to buy an M3, this video will apply to you as well. So the first few issues we're going to talk about are related to the SMG. So the E46 M3 was available with the SMG. The SMG is pretty much a hydraulically operated manual transmission. So it still is an actual manual transmission, but instead of having a clutch pedal, you have a hydraulic unit called the SMG Pump that actuates the slave cylinder and allows you to switch gears. So there's a whole mechanism that's added to the transmission. So the transmission itself is actually very similar between the manual and the SMG, and you can actually convert the SMG transmission into a fully manual transmission. So the first issue we're going to talk about is the pump itself. So when the SMG pump goes out, you pretty much can't operate the car anymore. And the pump itself is actually a very expensive item. A new pump is around $3,500 to $3,800. You can get the pumps rebuilt if it's just a seal issue, and the rebuilds are usually around $500-600 plus labor. And then if you have an electronic issue, you're usually left with buying a new pump. Another alternative to this is you can actually convert the whole car to a true manual by adding a clutch pedal, taking off the transmission, either switching the bell housing from a manual transmission, or you get the bell housing machined on the SMG transmission, and you add all this stuff for the shifter to be able to center, which is usually the main difference. I actually have a video on this on the vlog channel. Make sure you go check that out. And we do offer that service here. A rough cost estimate, if you were going to go from SMG to manual, is around $4,000. That includes most of the maintenance items. It also includes a shifter, shift knob, the machining of the bell housing. Pretty much the whole swap is covered at that point. And then if you wanted to do other extra stuff, that would be added on top. The SMG pump usually tends to let go around 100,000 miles and higher. It's obviously going to be a lot quicker if you do track the car, which is the SMG is very good at that, and that's probably one of the reasons that it was such a great option at the time, was because it's a lot quicker for you to use the paddles to shift rather than actually shifting manually on the track. But continuing on with the SMG, there's also smaller issues with the system, like the gear position sensor. The gear position sensor can also cause you not to be able to turn on the car. It can cause limp mode issues. It can cause you to be stuck in gear, stuck out of gear, and that's actually a little bit cheaper of a part, but that is also a very common issue, as is the slave cylinder for the SMG system. And it works like any other slave cylinder. If it's leaking or if the seal goes bad, then you're going to have issues of getting into gear. And then finally, with the SMG and even some of the manual transmissions, some issues that you see with the transmission are the shift detents. So the detent themselves can get stuck sometimes, but the bigger issue is the spring that's in them. So sometimes the springs, they'll end up breaking, which will result in sloppy shifting, which will cause issues to upshift, downshift if you have SMG. It can also have issues with gear engagement if you're just a true manual. So with the SMG issues knocked out of the way, we can continue on with the rest of the car. So this applies to all the M3s, the Vanos. So there's a few issues that rely with the Vanos. There's the Vanos solenoids that tend to go bad. There's also the Vanos actuators can also go bad. But with those two issues, there are rebuild kits available. There's a very good company called Vanos Systems, and they actually have rebuilt units that are available for sale. They've got the whole solenoid packs that are available, and it's actually not that expensive of an ordeal. The Vanos hubs, they tend to have tabs that shear off time to time, as well as sometimes the bolts back off or the head of the bolt will break off, and that can cause very, very bad issues. And there are replacement options for that as well that you can do preventatively. So you can get a whole rebuilt Vanos kit. You can get crypto treated hubs, which pretty much the hubs themselves are treated with heat. It's a whole different system, and it makes the hub a lot stronger so the tabs don't shear off, and that's also an available option. You can buy a whole kit that has the whole Vanos system rebuilt, and you just slap it on. If you do wait until the last minute and something does go wrong with the Vanos system, chances are that sometimes the motor cannot be salvageable if things went really, really wrong. But often you can still salvage the motor if the Vanos does break. Now, another major issue that I talked about in my other video but is even more prominent on the M3 is the rear subframe floor cracking. So by this, what I mean is where the rear subframe attaches to the car's chassis. Those mounting points tend to tear out. What will happen is because of all the stress, they will crack, and if the crack is not treated in an appropriate time, it'll keep getting worse and worse, and by the time it's really bad, your only option is going to be to replace the entire floor. There was a class action lawsuit that forced BMW to repair a bunch of these, so make sure that's been repaired. Even if it has been repaired, I would still recommend doing reinforcements such as the Vince bar, the Mason Engineering bar, even just the plates at the very least. I would also pair all of that stuff with the structural foam. I've got videos on all this on the main channel, and that just makes it so that way you don't have any issues in the future. Continuing on with the drivetrain, as far as we're talking about the rear subframe, the M3s come with a limited slip differential. And a lot of people notice that sometimes when you're taking sharp turns, the differential will grind. If that begins to happen, what you can do is you can do a fluid change and add a friction modifier, or you go to the dealership and get the fluid that they have with the friction modifiers already put in. That fluid is about $50 for a half a liter, and you will need about 4 bottles to make sure you have enough to top the whole differential up. I would recommend doing that regardless. And also another issue is there's play between the output shafts of the differential. In order to repair that, sometimes if there is a lot of play, you will have to replace the bearings inside. Some play is normal, but I would just double check, make sure whoever's servicing your car, tell them to take a look at it and see how bad it is. If you wait too long, that will cause worse issues in the differential, and you might end up having to buy a rebuilt unit at the end of the day. Oh, that's a lot of play. This side doesn't. This side has a lot more. This side has a lot more play. And this is the passenger side, which is usually the one that does have the most play. A little bit is very common. It's almost in all of them I see. But if you have a lot, then you're going to have a lot more noises, and eventually the differential will have to be rebuilt. So another common issue with the M3s, this is more specific to the early model 01, 02, and 03, is the rod bearings. There was a recall on this, and a lot of them should have already been performed. The rod bearings that they were using in the early model S54s was weak and would spin, causing significant issues to the motor. But since that was a recall, most of those cars should have already been taken care of, and you shouldn't have any issues with that. But if you are buying an early model E46, just double check, make sure all that stuff has been taken care of, and there are records for it. You can still do rod bearings on newer E46 M3s like the 04 and up, and just do those preventatively, but usually those don't have as many issues as the early models did. Continuing on with the motor, there's also issues with the throttle position sensors. These are not expensive, but as with any electronic part, they do tend to fail. But there are three different throttle position sensors on the M3. There's one on top of the oil filter housing, there's one underneath the intake manifold near the actuator, and there's also one that's on the pedal itself. So either one of these can go bad and will cause you to have an EML light, will pretty much put you in limp mode, you won't be able to rev as much, and will have a significant loss of power. But that's a very common issue, and you usually get a fault code right away, and you can pinpoint which one is wrong by testing it with the multimeter or just by swapping them around and replacing them. With also throttle position sensors, sometimes the actuators do go bad as well. Since there are individual throttle bodies on the E46 M3, there's an actuator that controls that. If the actuator goes bad, it's a pretty expensive part, it's around $500 to $600, and that would also cause you to have an EML light and an unresponsive throttle. So that's another common issue, and there are a bunch of throttle actuators that are available. You can buy them used, you can buy them new. They also have rebuild kits where you can replace the gears inside. Along with the throttle actuators, keep an eye on all the throttle linkage for all the individual throttle bodies. Make sure there's nothing that's obstructing them, make sure they stay clean. You can also lubricate them with silicone spray or even white lithium grease just to make sure they're nice and smooth. Now the E46 M3, unlike the non-M, has a pretty good cooling system. They do have a separate oil cooler as well. You don't really have as many issues with things breaking on the cooling system as with the non-Ms, but that's still, I would still recommend being preventative, do water pump, thermostat, expansion tank, hoses and stuff like that, just to stay on top of it. Besides that, as far as oil leaks go, one of the major oil leaks that's always confused for a rear main seal is actually the CPV O-ring. So the CPV O-ring is on the actual side of the block, and it's just a small screw that has it's like a flathead screw, and it goes into the block. You have to unscrew it, and there's an O-ring on it that tends to go dry and brittle, and it'll start leaking oil, and it'll go running down the side of the block in between the transmission and the engine itself. So if you have an M3, if it has not been replaced, they do make different aftermarket O-rings that usually don't ever leak again. So make sure you try to go ahead and get that done if it hasn't been done already. Another thing, like I said about the cooling systems, these cars don't have as many issues with them, but one of the major things that a lot of people overlook is the fan clutch itself. Whenever the fan clutch stops operating to its optimum efficiency, you will end up having heat issues. You might start overheating very slightly. Your oil temperatures can also start increasing a little bit. But I would replace the fan clutch preventatively just to make sure that you don't ever experience any overheating issues, especially if you plan on tracking the car, stuff like that. You can also put aftermarket fans. They do make a bunch of aftermarket cooling system components, such as an aluminum radiator, aftermarket oil coolers. So look into all of that if you do plan on driving the car hard, or if you are in a lot warmer climate, such as Arizona, even Southern California, even Florida, places like that. Now that pretty much concludes all of the mechanical aspects, and like I said, this is not a specific issue. This is more of common issues with the whole M3 as a whole. So obviously there are a lot of other issues that can go wrong, but they're not as common as ones I've already mentioned. Now continuing with like cosmetic and interior, exterior issues, another major issue is the rear view mirror that's inside the cabin. So that has a auto dimming feature, and more often than not, by now most of them have already started leaking. Usually what will happen is the whole mirror will start bleeding. That's what they call it. You'll see that ink that's supposed to be dimming the mirror start to come through the whole mirror, and before you know it, the whole mirror is just going to be dim all the time. There are places that rebuild these mirrors for you. All you have to do is just take them off, send it in. I don't know how exactly they do it, but I'm pretty sure they just pull all the ink out, put a new filament, do whatever they need to do, and then you get a mirror back. It's going to be a lot cheaper than buying a new one, but that is a very common issue. Most of the other interior issues are very common with the whole E46 chassis, and they're covered in my other video. Now on the exterior, a lot more people notice this on the M3s if it has not been garaged. There's a lot of rubber seals that tend to get all cracked. They start drying up, and they'll start, some of them even get mushy, especially the window seals on the rear coder windows. Even the rear window seal as well, that's all the way around it. That one starts, getting all melted and stuff like that. The windshield cowl, that's a very common issue across all the E46s. That will just start cracking, and you'll start getting a lot of dirt and debris getting caught up in there. So just take a look at all of the rubber seals, try to replace them as soon as you can. That'll just prevent you from having any moisture getting inside the car, or any buildup of any sort of dirt that's going to be harder to remove later on. And now another common issue that a lot of people tend to overlook are the mirrors. So the E46 M3 mirrors are completely different than all of the other E46s. So their mirrors are round, and they tend to be loose. They loosen up over time, and this is curable. The main way to do it is you pull apart part of the mirror housing, and there's 2 screws on the bottom that you just have to tighten up. I do not have a DIY on this currently, but I will try to post one as soon as I can. But that's another very common issue on the exterior. Besides that, that pretty much concludes this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to leave a comment down below. If you need to get any of the service work done on your M3 and you are in Southern California, make sure you contact me. The easiest way is through Instagram at ShopLifeTV. That's also the easiest way to schedule any appointments for any service work, such as doing an SMG to manual conversion. I highly recommend that. It will save you a lot of headache later on. At the end of the day, it improves the driving experience as a whole. Anyways, thanks for watching, and stay tuned for my next video.